Post-war art in London is interesting. It's kind of similar to the art that you'll see in France, and it's got an expressionist bent towards it. It tends to be bleak. It tends to be somewhat existentialist in a way, in the sense that you see lots of individuals and you see a sense of kind of working through this situation in which people have been put in. It takes place after the war, obviously, and London is the center of the art world in England. And London had really been through a lot. Lots of air raids, lots of bombing had hit London, German bombing. People would go down into the subway lines when the air raid sirens went off. And it was a period that was really marked by a lot of anxiety, a lot of instability, and fear. One of the famous things that happened during the bombing raids of London is all the children were sent by train out to the countryside as an attempt to save them. And so families were separated from their children and they were anxious about that. And it really created a lot of drama and trauma with the English people. Afterward, families were reunited, but the devastation in London was just astounding. All kinds of ruins everywhere throughout the city. Henry Moore, who's often considered the most important sculptor in the 20th century in England, was doing works like this prior to the war, but he did a whole series of subway drawings that they're called, of citizens cowering in the darkness that are really kind of set the tone for the type of art that you'll see after the war in England. These drawings tend to be very dark, as it was dark down in the subway tunnels, and the people have very few details of their faces, so they're kind of just spectral images, almost like ghosts. You see the people stacked up, waiting, 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 having to sleep in this very confined space with absolute strangers next to you, pushed right up against you. Must have been very claustrophobic, and you're anxious. You're waiting to see if a bomb will drop directly on your tunnel and trap you all. So I mean, I just couldn't imagine that type of intensity that you see with the Henry Moore drawings of the subway. Although there was quite a bit of abstraction in England before the war, after the war, artists really turned to a form of social realism, of depicting the working poor in the city in really bleak environments. You see a lot of browns, a lot of grays, a lot of depressing scenes of empty tables with empty dishes and people who just don't have the finer things in life. The movement itself is called the Kitchen Sink School, and it literally got its name when a critic was referring to the artist Jack Smith and others like him, and he was referring to the painting on the left, which literally shows a kitchen sink. And the Kitchen Sink School is just all about this recording of the difficulties of life after the war, when it was very hard to get food, when food was rationed, and people just had to make do with the bare necessities in life in order to start rebuilding England. And you just have the most common of subject matter, bathing a child, in both of these instances, just this weary mother or grandmother or aunt or somebody on the right putting this child into a sink, or the child sort of been left in the kitchen sink over here. There's some like cut up melon on the table, but everything is muted and everything is gray. These are not heroic paintings. These are not paintings looking to explore the unconscious. These are not any of these avant-garde movements pushing art in a brand new direction. Instead, it's going back to the basics and using just the most mundane of chores, laundry, the most banal type of situations, a household, and kind of elevating it as works of art, but also the art itself is kind of bleak and depressing. So you have to wonder, is it elevating it? What's it doing? Many of these artists share the similar themes and subject matters and concerns. So you look at this work by Jack Smith on the left, and you look at this other artist, John Bratby. They knew each other. They shared a sensibility. These kids sitting at tables that have, in the one case with this kid, I don't know, onions, potatoes, piece of meat on a newspaper. And then this other girl, she's got some Kellogg's cornflakes. We can identify that. And other things on her table, a little bit more stocked over there on the right. And yet the conditions of the kitchen are just as bleak as the conditions on the right. I think one of the most fascinating thing about this time period in British history is that here's a painting movement that is firmly within the same orbit as a literary movement and a theatrical movement. So at the same time as you've got these painters focusing on the drama of everyday life, you also have what are called kitchen sink dramas, and these are plays that are set in the same type of settings, working class settings in London areas that typically don't get featured in writing or in literature about England. You have plays like Look Back in Anger on the left, or A Taste of Honey on the right, about working class relationships and working class entanglements and the things that impact the lives of the working poor. And at the same time this is happening, you've got this same situation in movies. So from plays to movies, It Always Rains on Sunday, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. Again, working class drama. You're brought right into these small apartments where families live, and families are struggling to get by, and then they also become involved in domestic situations and entanglements and love affairs, and it's just the type of the working class kind of living that people were fascinated by. People wanted to see this stuff at the time. And you saw the exact same thing on British television. You saw the exact same thing in British novels at the time. So, all of these different modes of artistic expression were were really just focusing in on contemporary urban issues, especially in lower working class. Kathy Come Home was a TV drama about homelessness. Up the Junction was a drama about factory work. And it's very rare that you have painting that fits so clearly in a niche of something other than itself, that you have it connecting with literature and with television, movies, and film at the same moment. In some cases it happens, but it doesn't quite overlap. But here in the middle of the 20th century, you've got everybody doing it at the same time. And it's one of the really first examples I can think of in the 20th century where it's so pervasive. More John Bratby, a toilet on the left, a bathroom sink on the right. More tables full of stuff. And what is going on? Is this just a typical breakfast or typical meal? Is this the fantasy of the working class that you'd have a table full of food and full of dishes? The figure on the left is nude. There's a figure over there ignoring the table. John Bradby's images of stocked tables kind of leave you wondering what he's trying to communicate here. It's these working class still life paintings in a way. And you'll notice that they have like the nice silverware out. They've got the nice dishware out frequently. Not something you'd see on an everyday table, like the crystal on the left or the wine glasses. Why is that? Edward Middleditch paints scenes from a butcher shop of pigs being slaughtered. Here's more Edward Middleditch. The woman on the right could be straight out of a Francis Gruber painting, just kind of sitting in this empty room, resting her hand on her head on her hand. The cat on the left, the cat doesn't seem depressed really, just cat-like, indifferent, wanting to get in that frying pan. Middleditch painted outside of the home as well. Here are two scenes from the street. But again, the street is dark, it's bleak. These are pigeons coming to a puddle in the city, or A Dead Pigeon is the title of the work on the right. They're so dark and kind of gloomy. It reminds me of that scene in Mary Poppins when the woman is outside of the bank and she's feeding the birds and they come all over her. Remember that? Anyway, Middleditch also paints these images that are really pure abstract. If you look at them, they're quite lovely, a lyrical kind of water, a lyrical abstraction. But in fact, they're water from the Thames River that runs through London, and it's dirty and it's not the freshest water out there. So this real intense grittiness, even when the images are abstract like this. In the paintings of Derek Greaves, he takes us outside of London, and so we go into the British countryside, but things don't get any better. The grass is not green, the grass is brown, maybe from that dog's peeing on it. It's, we've got a runaway dog there. We don't get the sense that that dog is anybody's pet that's being looked after well. You look to the countryside, it's a factory town, smokestacks, gray skies, dead grass. Again, bleak, bleak, bleak. Another of these abandoned kind of landscapes where the focus is on this building that is occupied. It's titled Humanity is the name of the piece. It's got a banner that's the logo of some company that's also called Humanity, but there is no humans here. Or this image that's just titled Steward, where you've got this man in a suit, and then again, just a very bleak background. You might think things might lighten up when he paints children, but it doesn't. Here you've got this image on the left. Looks like this kid is dead, right? Or the work on the right, for that matter. Both of them look like these children are dead. Are they dead? Are they doll babies? They don't look comfortable. But in fact, they're both just sleeping babies. This one on the left is a baby in a stroller, and the work on the right is actually his firstborn son. Although it gives me the creeps, but that's just this kind of kitchen school realist kind of aesthetic, no romanticism. In 1952, Greaves went to Italy for a time period and spent some time there and painted some Italian subjects like this goat and these farmers on the left. But although the colors kind of brighten up a little bit in the Italian countryside, the mood doesn't really. You still have this sense of somber depression that you've got with the figures back in gray old England. Peter Coker, like Edward Middleditch, paints slaughterhouses, paints these animal carcasses being cut up by butchers, kind of a metaphor for modern life, metaphor for the times after the war. And I gotta say, although these are all bleak and kind of strange, these artists were in the mainstream. These were artists who had success painting works like this. These artists represented England at the Venice Biennale in, I think, 1952, 53, which was this major international art exhibition. It was something that was, again, this effort to bring about international cooperation. And this is what England wanted to present to the world. So this work wasn't just like nobody saw it and people didn't appreciate it. It was what was considered to be good English art. He was well known for doing still lifes of dead animals as well, so not just in the butcher shop, but butchering animals at home. Here you've got this head of a pig on the left and a dead chicken on the right, or a dead rabbit on the right, and two sheep carcasses on the left. People were hungry, people wanted to eat. If you've never been to England, you might not know that people get very attached to their local pubs. And Ruskin Spear, the next artist, who's one of my favorite kitchen sink artists, really understood that about the nature of British people. And he painted all these incredible scenes that take place in the local pub. It's some place where different people meet from different walks of life. They come in, they enjoy themselves, they have drinks, they play darts, and it's just this sort of crux of working class life. And he hones in on these wonderful scenes of everyday life in these pubs. Pubs still very much look this way in England. Oftentimes, you've got these small places with red walls or dark walls, and when they get busy, people are just packed in. But most people know each other, and people have fun, and it's a sense of community and camaraderie. And you get that sense in these paintings, even though they're kind of claustrophobic in a way, which is the way pubs are. It's still this kind of fun space. You get the sense that, people from Wisconsin would like these paintings. You get the sense in looking at these paintings by Ruskin Spear that he's painting regulars in these bars, and that the bartenders, that the bartenders are friendly and like people that are open and want to talk to you. There's just a real kind of pleasantness to all of these works by Spear. So something of a social critic. The work on the left is titled High Fashion, and it's taken from a newspaper photograph that showed the like Fashion Week in London, and he kind of spoofs it in the way that he's got these older ladies kind of looking down their nose at the model, and there's also kind of a coldness to the work on the left. Whereas again, his pub scenes are so warm and so full of character and so full of charm that you've got these two different worlds that go on in London. Spear was also just a terrific painter of house cats. I love the work on the left. It's like the cat sitting down, getting ready to eat his fish. Or, what cats do, just sleep all the time. So, you've got this great uh, kind of warmth coming from Ruskin Spear that you often find lacking in some of the other kitchen sink painters. It's charming. One of my absolute favorite paintings in the world is the work on the left. I don't know why, I can't explain it. It's just that if you've ever fallen over suddenly and been jarred, especially as an adult, it is jarring, and this kind of perfectly captures that. And that's a stupid reason to love a painting, but I still love it. So it's a work by Michael Andrews, who isn't so much kitchen sink anymore. We're kind of leaving this kitchen sink territory after we've talked about Ruskin Spear and moving into this group of artists that are known as the School of London. And their years are kind of 1955 to 1962-ish as we move into a new era. These artists are artists that continue to paint after 1962 and continue to develop and do other things. So for a couple of them, I'll kind of push them through into, I'll show you some examples of their work past 1962. But they don't share the focus on working class Londoners any longer with the kitchen sink school or the kind of gritty, depressive type of atmosphere that kitchen sink school does. So instead, you've got images that just vary. They are all figurative painters, so they carry that idea forward of figuration in London. And Michael Andrews is one of the best, although his contribution is not as much as other artists because he leaves London after a few years and kind of disappears from the art scene. But before he leaves, he paints these incredible paintings: The Man Who Suddenly Fell Over, the work on the left, and then The Beach on the right, where you've got this same kind of figure, this big bulky man in his big dark suit who is walking on the beach, and he seems terribly overdressed. And he kind of represents this everyman, kind of like Homer Simpson before Homer Simpson ever was thought about. Michael Andrews was very experimental. He was committed to figuration, but he liked to experiment with elements of abstraction. As you can see on the guy's face on the left, it's kind of got this wonderful smudgy characteristic to it. Or also these bathers, this father and son who are in this pool or river or something. And just the way you go from the naturalism of the figures above the water. And then once you get below it, you've got this just kind of wonderful water distortion or the kicks of the little kid in the pool. It's just really very nice and well done. As London emerged out of the economic depression of the early 50s and moved towards the end of the 1950s into the early 60s, it started to get a lot more economically sound. And this made Michael Andrews really fascinated by this nightlife that he saw all around him, people having fun, going to upscale clubs, and it's kind of moving into what's known as the swinging 60s in London, where you've got people just really enjoying themselves in an upscale way. And so he made paintings about it. This is titled All Night Long. It's a triptych divided into three, looking at the lives of people who go to these nightclubs and get all fancy. He felt there was something really hollow and shallow about this all. So, Good and Bad at Games is the way he ends up feeling about this nightlife that he's watched and he's experienced. And he's got these figures that are all based on people that he knew, actually, and he turns them into these Giacometti sculptures, actually. He was fascinated with Giacometti. He had lots of photographs of Giacometti sculptures in his studio that he was looking at when he did this painting. And he transforms his friends into these long, excessively skinny, extenuated, attenuated figures, and gives it a very strange overall look. The next two artists who are affiliated with the School of London are two artists whose work is rather unique and very similar to one another. They are from Scotland. They were both working class and met in art school. They are Robert Colquhoun and Robert McBride, but everybody referred to them as the two Roberts because as soon as they met in art school, they fell in love and they began a lifelong romance. And they lived openly as two gay men at a time when it was extremely dangerous in England for that to happen. The police actively persecuted gay men, sent them to prison, ruined their careers, and it was a very ugly time to be gay in England. And yet they felt like they had to be true to themselves, and so they just lived their lives and accepted the consequences. Luckily, there weren't too severe consequences for these guys. They moved to London in 1941 and quickly found work and found early fame. Unfortunately, the fame didn't last, and so by the 50s, they were kind of destitute. They didn't come from money, and they really depended upon the finances from selling paintings or doing illustration and design work that they could pick up along the way. Nevertheless, they were important parts of this London social scene that centered around the arts. They knew Francis Bacon. They were friends with Francis Bacon, with Lucian Freud, with others that were in their circle, and they were really kind of considered the the linchpin of that group. They often had people over to their place. Their place served as the center of activities. in many ways. This is from a newspaper article that was published about them. Of course, it didn't mention their homosexuality in any way. It was just like, oh, look, these guys are such close friends that they share a studio and they live together. Oh, well. Yeah. So, anyway, let's look at their work and we'll see how similar it is to each other. Both of them were influenced by Cubism and by Surrealism, and they each developed this kind of distinct aesthetic in which they painted individuals and other subjects uh, almost as if they are pieces of puzzles that have been put together. For example, the work on the right, the woman with the cat, you see how the arm is one material and the hand is another, and then the shoulder is another, each segmented and broken up into its own discrete area as if it's a collage, but it's not a collage, it's a painting of that's just the solitary figure. On the left, again, you've got this solitary figure with a very distinctive um, uh, look that's typically Colquhoun and McBride. They're very similar. She's also holding a cat. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of dark in there and holding up a ball. So the scenes are kind of playful scenes of these women with these cats, although the overall effect is somewhat unsettling. It doesn't exactly feel happy. It doesn't feel funny. And that could be because of the dark, like umber that he uses, this yellow that gives it a somber feel, or the heavy clothing of the woman on the left. So you can see that they're kind of kitchen school aspects to this particular image, and you'll see it popping up sometimes in the work of Robert McBride as well. Frequently, figures are alone in Colquhoun's work, which kind of puts it as typical of this post-war period. The work on the left is titled Woman with Still Life, and she's a woman all in blue, segmented into geometric form, and holding up a skull, kind of Picasso-like skull there. Or on the right is two actors on stage, and you've got these unusual instance of two people together in a work by Colquhoun. Although he definitely owed a debt of gratitude to Picasso and to early Cubists, Colquhoun definitely takes his figures into completely different directions than some of the French Cubists did. He really experiments with the human form, especially in faces, and I think when we look at Francis Bacon, we'll see how Francis Bacon picks up some of Colquhoun's experiments and takes them even further. On the left is Colquhoun's man with a donkey saddle, and on the left is woman with goat. And you see just, again, more and more experimentation in these faces and in the figures. For my money, Robert McBride is one of the great still life painters of all time. He really gives Juan Gris, an early Spanish cubist, a run for his money. If you know his work, he was a fantastic still life painter as well. Here are a couple of McBrides, one of his earlier still lives on the left, and then a later one, still life with cucumber on the right. He just has this fantastic sense of texture, of space. As he progresses in his painting, he deletes certain details, like naturalistic details like the wood of the cutting board, and he really goes for this all over really bold, flat design. Here's two more that just, I could look at these every day, all day. Still life with chicken bone on the right, and some other still life, I forget what the specific title is, on the left. Those greens are so nice, aren't they? Ah. McBride also painted figurative images, images of cats, as so many British painters seem to have done at mid-century. Here on the left, he's combined a still life with an image of a cat, and then on the right, you've got this strange image of a man, a woman, and their pig. So some of these things you can get a sense in the coloring and also in this sort of eerie subject matter that there's holdovers of kitchen school influence. I think if you look for them, I think that Robert McBride and Robert Colquhoun tried to make some of their works sort of fit that niche in an effort to exhibit with them. And in fact, they did exhibit with some of the kitchen sink painters at a certain point in the late 50s. But it wasn't really the natural fit for those two. It doesn't seem they were much more kind of high art, influenced by major artists like Picasso, like Juan Gris, and it's not quite as down and gritty as the kitchen sink painters, and just as kind of basic, which is ironic when you consider that Robert McBride and Colquhoun were from working class, that they were working class painters, that was what they knew, but their art was considered a little bit more elevated than that of the kitchen sink painters. And you can definitely see where the two artists influenced each other. There's so much in common in their figures in particular. So they lived together until 1962, when unfortunately Robert Colquhoun got ill and died very suddenly. And Robert McBride only lived 4 more years, and then he got accidentally hit by a car and died. So that was kind of a tragic and unfortunate end. When they died, I mean, they were in one of these low points where they were desperately poor, and so they never lived. Neither one of them really lived to see their work become well known, collected in major museums, and see their reputation kind of grow and grow like it has to this day. Another School of London artist who ended up becoming a huge influence, particularly in the field of illustration, is this man named John Minton. John Minton was also gay and hung out with the two Roberts and others in the School of London group. This is him on the left, a photo portrait. He had a very distinctive look, and people often painted his portrait. So there's two portraits of him by different artists, just on the other in the middle and on the right there. John Minton is somebody who in 1957 killed himself, committed suicide. He suffered from depression, probably would be diagnosed as bipolar today because he experienced some pretty severe mood swings and long episodes of depression. But before that, and that probably added to his legacy as an important person in terms of the field that he helped to establish, which was this field of illustrational graphic design. He was trained as a painter, though, and he did these interesting compositions of people looking very idiosyncratic and distinctive with these large heads. They're almost cartoons, but they're not quite. They've got an illustrational quality to them. But there's also interesting aspects of abstraction. So his work really fits in well with the two Roberts in terms of stylistic similarities. But you see, it also fits in with this post-war England where you've got these buildings that are kind of empty and streets and these kids that are standing in sort of isolation. They almost are like I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Village of the Damned with all those possessed children, but they're kind of like that. The subject of an empty, abandoned city kind of becomes a theme for John Minton, as you can see in both of these. The work on the right does have two figures in the foreground, but otherwise it's kind of abandoned, creepy cityscape. And here's two examples of the illustration work that found him a lot of success by the middle of the 1950s. He was in great demand as an illustrator for the publishing industry in particular, where he did dust jackets for books. These are two examples of that. But he also did illustrations for magazines and for single issue, like posters. So very successful illustration, but unfortunately he killed himself in 1957. Along with Francis Bacon, Lucian Freud is the other artist from the School of London that became extremely famous later in the 20th century. In the 90s, he became known as one of the most successful realist painters and portrait painters, especially in the world. And he started, though, in the 1940s and 50s with these kind of bizarre paintings that have a lot to indebted to surrealism and just this sort of post-war funk where these figures look out at us kind of alienated. You've got the girl in the bed with blackened eyeballs, or this guy who seems to be staring at this scary spiky origami thing, leaf, root. I don't know what it is. And then the figure next to the girl, all in shadow, bleak, strange. We don't know what's going on. It's vaguely unsettling. There's almost a cartoony quality in some of these early works. Look at that kitty cat being grabbed around the neck by that girl with the very far apart eyes, or this figure of the guy confronting the plant that seems to be a little bit ridiculous, but fun at the same time. To paint, as we move forward chronologically in time, you can see that he starts to become a little bit more of a realist in his work, a little bit more shadow, a little bit more modeling of form. Things become a little bit more like we would expect to see if we were looking at somebody in actual our space. And that tendency really goes further and further as we move from the 60s into the 1970s, and you've got a much greater sense of realism. But there's also still this sense of strangeness. There's awkwardness. You've got this model laying on the bed with her leg awkwardly up, and it just draws attention to the strangeness of these situations. This man with his shirt off, but then a dog in his lap. Freud often paints these models in the act of modeling and shows the boredom of it and the reality of it. It's not some idealized vision of a model in an artist's studio. This one in particular, the ruddiness of her face, where she's got this sunburn on her face, but really nowhere else, makes it seem a little bit slightly disturbing. Lucian Freud is the grandson of Sigmund Freud, so there's that psychoanalytical overlay of sexuality and psychosexual intrigue that goes into his portraits of these naked individuals. And he doesn't exempt himself from that scrutiny. Here's two portraits of the artist as sort of standing in this unflattering light or in this awkward positioning on the bed, again with a dog. And the twisting, turning body forms uh, really accentuate the awkward quality, obviously. Although the figure that is on the left in the bed with the dog, and then you see the knees of the figure under the bed. Is it somebody? Is it a corpse? Is it the boogeyman? Is the person on the bed dead? They seem alive, but they also seem dead at the same time. And that's what's so fascinating about Freud's work. It's just got all the psychological tension in it. Into the 1980s, he continues to paint and he becomes known as this painter of flesh. He chooses as his models large figures and he paints them with this exuberance, with this just magnificent handling of paint. And people come to just really appreciate his handling of flesh in particular. But again, there's still awkward and strangeness to these. This continues into the 90s and to the early 2000s as well, as he continues to explore flesh as a subject. There are a couple of sculptors associated with the School of London as well. Kenneth Armitage works in bronze. I particularly like the figure on the left because it goes along nicely with Michael Andrews' man who suddenly fell over. Has this sort of twist where he creates these hybrid figures that are, not completely unlike some things that we might see Germain Richier creating over in France at the same time. These alien composite beings that are really fascinating. Here's a couple more of those figures that he does. Oftentimes, these are smaller figures found on desktops or tabletop sculptures, but occasionally you'll see a very large scale sculpture done by Armitage. Michael Ayrton as well does these sculptures that are of composite figures or decaying figures or violent figures that seem in that kind of existentialist school as well, screaming and tearing themselves apart in some cases. He was also a painter, but he split his time between sculpture and painting. And here's two more of his mid-century School of London bronze figures. Today, the School of London artist most well known is Francis Bacon, and he also stands for just this entire expressionist anxiety at the end of the war and at this post-war period. His work really embodies alienation, and it uh, gives us this existential angst and this sense of an individual who is at odds with society. So, an examination of Francis Bacon is really an insight into the entire post-war world of this type of outlook. I'm going to stop here though and pick up Francis Bacon in his own PowerPoint. So this will end the post-war England PowerPoint, and there will be one more shorter Francis Bacon one left to do.